In the harsh Arizona territory of 1859, widower Elias Fletcher pulled a waterlogged coffin from Silver Creek, expecting to find death, but instead discovered a breathing woman who would change his life forever. What desperate secret had driven someone to fake her burial and cast her into the rushing water? The screaming wind across the Arizona desert woke Elias Fletcher before dawn, just like it had every morning since Martha died. He rolled from his narrow bed in the one-room cabin, his joints creaking like old leather. Outside, Silver Creek was running higher than he'd seen it in months, swollen with unexpected autumn rains that had turned the usually dry stream bed into a rushing torrent. It was October in 1859, and the Arizona Territory was still wild country where a man could disappear without a trace. Elias had learned that lesson the hard way when Apache raiders took his neighbor's cattle just last spring. But this morning felt different somehow, heavy with possibility and dread. He pulled on his worn boots and stepped onto the porch, coffee cup steaming in his weathered hands. The creek's roar was so loud, it nearly drowned out the sound of his own thoughts. Thoughts that these days always drifted back to Martha's grave, behind the cabin, marked with a simple wooden cross he'd carved himself. "Another day, Martha," he whispered to the wind, a habit that worried his few remaining neighbors. "Another day to figure out why I'm still here." The fence line along the creek had taken a beating during yesterday's storm. 3 posts had snapped clean through, and his small herd of cattle could wander off if he didn't fix it soon. In this harsh country, losing even one cow meant the difference between eating and going hungry come winter. Elias grabbed his tools and headed toward the swollen creek, his boots squelching in mud that smelled of sage and distant rain. The morning sun painted the desert rocks in shades of red and gold, beautiful enough to take a man's breath away if he had time for such things. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong with the creek's wild song, a steady bumping noise, like someone knocking on a door that would never open. Elias stopped walking and tilted his head, listening hard. There it was again, rhythmic and persistent, coming from somewhere downstream, where the creek curved around a stand of cottonwood trees. He followed the sound, curiosity overcoming caution. As he rounded the bend, his eyes widened in disbelief. Something large and dark bobbed in the rushing water, caught against a fallen log that stretched halfway across the creek, something that looked impossible in this remote place. "What in blazes?" Elias muttered, dropping his tools and wading into the cold water. The current was stronger than it looked, tugging at his legs and threatening to sweep him downstream. But he pressed forward, driven by a need to understand what he was seeing. As he got closer, the impossible thing became undeniably real. It was a coffin. Not just any coffin, but a beautiful one made of dark wood that gleamed even while soaked with creek water. Brass handles caught the morning light, and intricate carvings decorated its sides, the kind of craftsmanship that cost serious money. This wasn't some rough pine box knocked together by a local carpenter. This was the sort of coffin rich folks used back east, the kind that spoke of love and loss and resources most frontier families could only dream of. Elias circled the floating coffin, his heart pounding. Who would build something so fine only to lose it to a creek? And how had it ended up in Silver Creek, miles from the nearest town of any size? The closest cemetery was a full day's ride away in Tucson, and even that was just a small plot behind the mission church. The brass nameplate on the coffin's lid was tarnished but readable. In elegant script, it bore a single name, Helena. No last name, no dates, just that one word that somehow made the whole situation feel even more mysterious. "Helena," Elias said aloud, testing the name on his tongue. It sounded foreign, European maybe, like the German settlers he'd met trading in Tucson. But what was a fancy European coffin doing, floating down his creek? A new sound made him look up sharply, hoofbeats coming fast from the direction of town. Elias quickly waded back to shore, his mind racing. Should he try to pull the coffin out of the creek? Should he ride to town and fetch help? Should he pretend he'd never seen it at all? The rider appeared through the morning haze, young Ben Morrison, from the neighboring spread. His horse lathered with sweat, and his face pale with urgency. Ben was barely 20, still new enough to the territory that he jumped at shadows and asked too many questions. "Mr. Fletcher," Ben called out, reining in his horse at the creek's edge. "Thank God I found you. There's been trouble in town. Big trouble." Elias glanced back at the coffin, still trapped against the log, then focused on Ben's worried face. What kind of trouble? Murder, maybe. Or kidnapping. Nobody's sure yet. Ben's words tumbled over each other in his excitement. That rich German fellow, Dr. Brenner, came riding into town last night, screaming about his missing daughter. Says someone stole her, right out of their hotel room. The name on the coffin flashed through Elias's mind. Helena. His stomach clenched with sudden understanding, though he kept his face carefully blank. "What's that got to do with me?" he asked. "Sheriff Hayes is forming a search party. Says every man in the territory needs to help look for her." Ben paused, his eyes scanning the creek behind Elias. "Say, what's that floating out there? Looks like." Elias stepped sideways, blocking Ben's view of the coffin. "Storm debris. Creek's full of it after yesterday's rain. You said something about a missing girl?" Ben's attention snapped back to his news. "Helena Brenner. Her name is. Pretty as a picture, according to her father. But here's the strange part, Dr. Sense. Brenner says she was already dead when she got stolen." The words hit Elias like a punch to the gut. He forced himself to keep breathing normally, to show nothing on his face. Dead? How's someone steal a dead person? That's what's got everyone puzzled. Dr. Brenner says his daughter died of some kind of brain fever 2 days ago. They were transporting her body back east for burial when their wagon got attacked. When the smoke cleared, the coffin was gone, but everything else was left behind. Elias's mind raced. A dead girl named Helena, missing from a coffin that had somehow ended up in his creek. But if she was dead, why did he feel like the coffin in the water held secrets more dangerous than any corpse? "Sheriff wants everyone to meet at the church in an hour," Ben continued. "We're going to search every canyon and wash between here and Mexico if we have to. Dr. Brenner's offering $1,000 for information about his daughter." $1,000. More money than Elias had seen in 5 years of scraping a living from this harsh land. Enough to fix his cabin, buy more cattle, maybe even head back east where life was easier. All he had to do was tell Ben about the coffin bobbing 20 feet away. But something held him back. Maybe it was the careful way Dr. Brenner had described his daughter's death. Maybe it was the expensive coffin that didn't match the story of a wagon attack. Or maybe it was just the stubborn streak that had kept him in the territory when smarter men headed for California. "I'll be there," Elias told Ben, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Ben nodded and wheeled his horse around, kicking it into a gallop toward town. Elias watched until the dust cloud disappeared, then turned back to the creek where Helena's coffin waited, like a question he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. The coffin had shifted during his conversation with Ben, the current pushing it further against the fallen log. Elias waded back into the cold water, his boots slipping on the rocky creek bottom. Up close, he could see that the wood was still solid despite its soaking, the brass fittings barely tarnished. Whatever had happened to put this coffin in the water, it hadn't been floating long. He ran his hands along the smooth sides, looking for damage that might explain how it ended up here. No bullet holes, no axe marks, nothing to suggest violence. The brass nameplate read, "Helena," in flowing script, just as he'd seen before. But now he noticed something else, tiny holes near the head of the coffin, perfectly round and evenly spaced, almost like air holes. He whispered, his blood running cold. Air holes meant this coffin had been built for someone who might need to breathe, which meant Helena Brenner might not be as dead as her father claimed. Elias's hands found the brass latches that held the coffin lid in place. They were well oiled and moved easily, as if they'd been designed to open from both inside and outside. His heart hammered against his ribs as he worked the first latch free, then the second. The morning sun was climbing higher, and he could hear birds starting their daily songs in the cottonwoods. Normal sounds of a normal day, except nothing about this felt normal anymore. He was about to open a coffin that might contain a corpse, or might contain something far more complicated. The lid was heavier than expected, waterlogged and swollen, but it opened smoothly on well-made hinges, revealing white silk lining that glowed in the morning light. And there, nestled in the silk, like a sleeping princess from one of Martha's fairy tale books, lay Helena Brenner. Elias had prepared himself for the sight of death. What he wasn't prepared for was the slow rise and fall of her chest, the faint pink flush in her cheeks, the way her dark hair spread across the silk pillow like spilled ink. She was alive, deeply asleep but undeniably breathing. She looked to be about 25, with the kind of delicate features that spoke of careful breeding and soft living. Her dress was made of fine blue silk, the kind of fabric that cost more than most families saw in a year. Around her throat hung a silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful. But it was her hands that told a different story. Her fingers were stained with ink, and he could see the small calluses that came from hours of writing. This wasn't some pampered rich girl who'd never worked a day in her life. This was someone who used her hands, who created things, who had skills beyond looking pretty at parties. A soft moan escaped her lips, and her head moved slightly against the pillow. Whatever drug had put her in this death-like sleep was starting to wear off. Soon she'd wake up, and then Elias would have to decide what to do with a woman whose own father claimed she was dead. The sound of more hoofbeats made him look up sharply. Not one horse this time, but several, coming from the direction of town. The search party was starting early, and they were heading straight for his property. Elias made a decision that would change everything. Instead of closing the coffin lid and letting the searchers find her, he lifted Helena from the silk-lined box. She was lighter than expected, her body relaxed in drug-induced sleep. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he caught the scent of lavender and something else, something medicinal and bitter. "Easy there," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him. "Whatever trouble you're in, we'll figure it out." He carried her up the slope toward his cabin, moving as quickly as he could while trying not to jostle her too much. Behind him, the empty coffin continued to bob against the fallen log, a mystery waiting to be discovered. The cabin's single room wasn't much a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and the stone fireplace Martha had insisted on when they built the place. But it was private, and right now privacy was exactly what Helena needed. Elias laid her gently on the bed, pulling Martha's old quilt up to her chin. The riders were getting closer now. He could hear voices calling back and forth, the organized sound of men conducting a search. Through the window, he glimpsed Sheriff Hayes leading a group of townsmen along the creek bank. They'd find the coffin soon enough, but by then, Helena would be safely hidden. A soft knock at the door made him freeze. "Fletcher, you in there?" It was Doc Harrison, the territory's only real doctor. A good man, but one who followed the law even when the law wasn't necessarily right. Elias glanced at Helena's sleeping form, made another quick decision, and opened the door just wide enough to slip outside. "Morning, Doc. Ben Morrison said you were forming a search party." Dr. Harrison was a thin man with kind eyes and careful hands. He'd tried to save Martha during her final illness, working day and night until exhaustion nearly killed them both. Elias trusted him more than most, but trust had its limits. "Strangest thing I ever heard," the doctor said, mopping sweat from his forehead. "This German fellow, Dr. Brenner, claims his daughter died of brain fever. But when I asked to examine the body, he said grave robbers had stolen it. Doesn't make sense, Elias. Who steals a corpse? Maybe someone who knew she wasn't really dead," Elias suggested carefully. Doc Harrison's eyes sharpened. "What makes you say that?" "Just thinking out loud. You know how these rich Eastern folks are about their medicine. Maybe this brain fever wasn't as final as he thought." "Catalepsy," the doctor murmured, almost to himself. I've read about cases where patients fall into such deep unconsciousness that they appear dead. If someone didn't know what to look for, he shook his head. But that would mean Dr. Brenner was about to bury his daughter alive. The words hung in the desert air like a death sentence. Elias felt his stomach clench with the implications. If Helena had been suffering from catalepsy, if her father had mistaken her condition for death, then the coffin in the creek represented something far more sinister than grave robbing. Course, that's just wild speculation, Elias said quickly. Probably just regular grave robbers, looking to steal her jewelry. But Doc Harrison wasn't listening anymore. His attention had shifted to something behind Elias, something visible through the cabin's single window. The doctor's face went pale, and his medical bag slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers. "Elias," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the creek's roar. "There's someone in your bed." The brass lock clicked open like a gunshot in the desert silence, and Elias Fletcher's world changed forever. Inside the polished coffin lay not death, but life. A young woman, with dark hair spread like silk across white satin, her chest rising and falling in steady breaths that seemed impossible after floating down Silver Creek. "She's alive," Ben Morrison whispered, his voice cracking like a boy's, though he was nearly 20. The young ranch hand had helped drag the heavy coffin from the muddy bank, but now he stepped backward, as if the woman might sit up and speak. Elias knelt beside the strange vessel, his weathered hands hovering over the sleeping figure. She wore a dress of deep blue silk, finer than anything he'd seen in the Arizona Territory. Around her pale throat hung a silver locket that caught the morning sun like a tiny mirror. "How can someone be breathing in a coffin?" Ben asked, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. The woman stirred at the sound of their voices. Her eyelids fluttered, and Elias caught a glimpse of brown eyes, flecked with gold, before they closed again. She mumbled something in a language he didn't recognize, soft words that sounded like music mixed with worry. "We need to get her out of there," Elias said, though his heart hammered against his ribs. What if this was some kind of trick? What if touching her would bring trouble to his small ranch? He pushed those thoughts away. Martha would have helped without question, and he could do no less. Carefully, he slipped his arms under the woman's shoulders and knees, lifting her from the satin-lined coffin. She weighed no more than a sack of grain, and her head fell against his shoulder, like she was simply sleeping. "Should we open that locket?" Ben suggested, pointing at the silver chain around her neck. "Might tell us who she is." Before Elias could answer, the woman's eyes opened fully. She looked up at him with confusion and fear, then spoke in that same foreign language, faster now, more urgent. When neither man responded, she switched to broken English. "Please, where am I?" "The water. So cold." Her voice was soft but clear, with an accent that made her words sound like a song. "You're safe now," Elias said gently, though he wasn't sure that was true. "You were in Silver Creek, in a coffin." Her face went white as fresh snow. "No, no, no," she whispered, trying to sit up. "They said I was dead. They told everyone I was dead." "Who told everyone?" Elias asked. But the woman had begun to shake like a leaf in a storm. Ben moved closer, his young face full of concern. "Miss, what's your name? How did you end up in that creek?" She looked between them, seeming to weigh whether she could trust these two strangers. Finally, she spoke. "My name is Helena, Helena Brenner, and if I am not dead," she touched the locket at her throat, "then I am in terrible danger." The sound of horses approaching fast made all three of them freeze. Through the cottonwood trees that lined the creek, Elias could see dust rising like smoke signals, multiple riders, moving with purpose toward his land. "Hide," Helena whispered urgently, struggling to stand on unsteady legs. "They have come for me." But there was nowhere to hide on the open ground beside Silver Creek. The coffin sat like evidence of something terrible, and Helena could barely walk after whatever had kept her sleeping so deeply. Elias made a decision that would change everything. "Ben, help me get her to the house, quick." They half-carried Helena toward the small adobe ranch house, while the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Behind them, the empty coffin remained by the creek, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. As they reached the wooden porch, Helena grabbed Elias's arm. "You do not understand," she said desperately. "My father is a powerful man. He will not let me go." "From what?" Elias asked. But the riders were already too close. Through the morning heat shimmer, he could see them clearly now, 5 men on horseback, led by someone in a black suit, despite the desert sun. They rode like men who were used to getting what they wanted, and they were heading straight for his ranch. Helena saw them too, and went even paler. "He found me," she breathed. "Even here, he found me." The lead rider raised his hand, and the group slowed to a walk as they approached the house. Elias could see the man's face, now older, with gray hair and cold eyes that missed nothing. This had to be Helena's father, and from the look of him, Ben had been right to worry. "Whatever happens," Elias told Helena quietly, "stay behind me." She nodded, but her hand found his arm again, and he could feel her trembling. Whatever had put her in that coffin, whatever had made someone want the world to think she was dead, it wasn't over yet. The riders stopped just outside the porch, their horses stamping and snorting after the hard ride. The man in the black suit dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving Helena's face. "My daughter," he said in accented English, his voice carrying both relief and anger. "Thank God you are safe." But Helena stepped further behind Elias, and he could feel her fear like heat from a fire. Helena's father stood like a statue carved from stone and fury, his gray eyes fixed on his daughter with the intensity of a hawk watching prey. The 4 men behind him remained mounted, their hands resting near their weapons in a way that made Elias's skin crawl. "Helena," the older man said again, this time in German. His voice held the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. But Helena answered in English, her chin lifted despite her obvious fear. "I will not go back, father. Not to that place. Not to him." Dr. Wilhelm Brenner, for Elias, had no doubt this was the man Helena feared, stepped closer to the porch. Up close, his expensive clothes and soft hands marked him as someone who had never worked a day under the desert sun. Everything about him spoke of money and power. "You are ill, my dear child," Dr. Brenner said smoothly. "The fever has affected your mind. You do not remember agreeing to the treatment." "Treatment?" Ben Morrison spoke up from where he stood near the creek. The young man had stayed behind, probably hoping to slip away unnoticed, but his sense of fairness wouldn't let him remain silent. "What kind of treatment put someone in a coffin?" One of the mounted men laughed, a sound like gravel scraping metal. "Boy should mind his own business," the man said, his hand moving to his gun. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. These weren't lawmen or doctors. They were hired guns, the kind of men who solved problems with bullets rather than words. "There has been a misunderstanding," Dr. Brenner continued, ignoring his man's threat. "My daughter suffers from episodes. During these times, she believes terrible things about her loving family. The treatment requires complete rest, away from anything that might disturb her recovery." Helena stepped forward, her fear replaced by blazing anger. "Lies," she said clearly. "All lies. Tell them about Otto Weiss, father. Tell them about the marriage contract you signed without asking me." Dr. Brenner's face darkened. "Otto is a good man who will provide well for you. Your childish infatuation with that schoolteacher has clouded your judgment." "Klaus," Helena whispered, and suddenly everything became clearer to Elias. This wasn't about illness or fever. This was about a father trying to control his daughter's choice of husband. "The schoolteacher filled your head with romantic nonsense," Dr. Brenner went on. "When you refused to see reason, when you threatened to elope with that penniless fool, we had no choice but to intervene. By putting me in a coffin," Helena's voice rose, "by telling everyone I had died of fever, by shipping me away like cargo." Ben stepped closer, his young face full of outrage. That's kidnapping, mister. That's against the law. The mounted gunman who had spoken before spat tobacco juice into the dust. Law's different for rich folks, boy, and Dr. Brenner here is very rich. Dr. Brenner held up a hand to quiet his man. I am her father, he said simply. Until she marries or reaches 25 years of age, she remains under my care. That is the law everywhere, including this godforsaken territory. Elias had remained silent, watching and listening, but now he spoke. Care doesn't involve fake funerals and drugged sleep. You know nothing of our circumstances, Dr. Tu. Brenner snapped. My daughter has been influenced by radical ideas about women's independence. She needs guidance, not encouragement in her foolishness. Helena laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Foolishness? Like mother's foolishness when she tried to leave you? The slap came so fast that Elias barely saw Dr. Brenner's hand move. Helena's head snapped to the side, and a red mark bloomed across her cheek. Without thinking, Elias stepped between them. His own hands clenched into fists. That's enough, he said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of 2 years' worth of bottled anger and grief. Dr. Brenner studied Elias for the first time, taking in his worn clothes, his sun-weathered face, his calloused hands. And who might you be? Elias Fletcher. This is my land. Ah, the grieving widower, Dr. Brenner said, and something in his tone made Elias's blood run cold. How did this man know about Martha? Yes, I made inquiries when we tracked the Coffin's path down the creek. You have my sympathy for your loss, Mr. Fletcher, but that does not give you the right to interfere with family matters. It gives me the right to protect someone on my property, Elias replied. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. The mounted men shifted in their saddles, and Ben Morrison's hand crept toward the rifle he kept on his horse. Helena stood frozen behind Elias, one hand pressed to her reddened cheek. Then Dr. Brenner smiled, and it was worse than his anger had been. Perhaps we can reach an understanding, he said smoothly. You are a poor man, Mr. Fletcher. Your ranch is small, your debts significant. I am prepared to be generous in exchange for your cooperation. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, thick with bills. $500 to forget you ever saw my daughter, enough to pay off your mortgage and buy supplies for the winter. The money was more than Elias made in 2 years of back-breaking work, enough to secure his future, to honor Martha's memory by keeping the ranch she had loved. All he had to do was walk away, let Helena return to whatever fate her father had planned. Helena's hand touched his shoulder, and he could feel her trembling again. What's it going to be, Mr. Fletcher? Dr. Brenner asked, the wallet still extended. Wisdom or foolishness? The sound of thundering hooves shattered the peaceful morning like glass hitting stone. Elias stepped protectively in front of Helena, as dust clouds rose beyond his wooden fence, revealing 6 mounted men riding hard toward his cabin. Their leader wore a star on his chest that caught the desert sun, Sheriff Hayes, but his face carried none of its usual friendly greeting. Fletcher, Hayes called out, dismounting with practiced ease. Behind him, 3 strangers in expensive Eastern clothes climbed down from their horses, with the careful movements of men unused to saddle work. Their leader, a tall man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, stepped forward with the confidence of someone who expected obedience. Helena's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers dug into Elias's arm with desperate strength. No, she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. Please, no. Good morning, Sheriff, Elias said, his voice steady despite the warning bells ringing in his head. Bit early for a social call, isn't it? The silver-haired stranger pushed past Hayes before the lawman could answer. My name is Dr. Wilhelm Brenner, he announced in heavily accented English. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I don't rightly know what you mean, Elias replied, but Helena's trembling behind him told a different story. Dr. Brenner's eyes found his daughter, and his expression softened with what might have been genuine concern if Elias hadn't seen the cold calculation lurking beneath. Helena, my dear child. We have been searching everywhere for you. When the wagon overturned in yesterday's flood, we feared." He paused, pressing a hand to his heart. "Well, what matters is that you are safe." "Wagon?" Elias questioned, his weathered hands clenching into fists. "Funny thing about that. I found your daughter in a coffin, not a wagon, and she was drugged with enough laudanum to kill a horse." One of Dr. Brenner's companions, a thin man with nervous eyes, stepped forward quickly. "The coffin was emergency transportation," he explained, stumbling over the words. "Miss Brenner suffers from severe hysteria, violent episodes. The laudanum was necessary to keep her calm during the journey to a private sanitarium in California." Helena finally found her voice, though it shook with barely contained fury. "Lies. Every word is lies." She moved to stand beside Elias, her chin raised defiantly. "I am not insane, Sheriff Hayes. I am a prisoner." "Now, miss," Sheriff Hayes said uncomfortably, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Your father here has legal papers. Says you've been declared mentally incompetent by 3 doctors in Chicago. Doctors my father paid." Helena shot back. "Men who never examined me, never spoke with me. They declared me insane for the crime of refusing to marry Otto Weiss, a man twice my age who sees women as property to be owned." Dr. Brenner's facade cracked slightly. "You know nothing of the world, Helena. This romantic foolishness, this infatuation with that worthless schoolteacher Klaus Ponsall, it has poisoned your mind against your own family." "The way you poisoned my mother's mind?" Helena's voice went deadly quiet. "Before she threw herself from your office window, rather than live another day under your control?" The silence that followed was so complete that Elias could hear his own heartbeat. Even the desert wind seemed to pause, waiting for what would come next. Sheriff Hayes cleared his throat nervously. "Now, that's a serious accusation, miss." "One that can be verified," Helena continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Anna Brenner died in Chicago on March 15th, 1857. The newspapers called it a tragic accident, a woman distraught over her daughter's illness. But the truth is simpler and uglier. My mother killed herself rather than watch her husband destroy her daughter, the way he had destroyed her." Dr. Brenner's face went white with rage. "You ungrateful child. After everything I have given you, education, culture, the finest of everything, and this is how you repay me? By spreading vicious lies and throwing yourself at the first man who shows you kindness?" "I have thrown myself at no one," Helena replied with dignity. "Mr. Fletcher saved my life, nothing more. But even if I had chosen him, that would be my right as a free woman." "You are not free," Dr. Brenner exploded. "You are my daughter, and you will obey me. The law is on my side." Elias had heard enough. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Helena and her father. "Maybe the law is on your side in Chicago, Dr. Brenner, but this is the Arizona territory. Out here, we have different ideas about what makes a person free. You have no legal standing in this matter," one of Brenner's companions warned. "Interfering with a father's lawful custody of his mentally incompetent daughter is a serious crime." "Is it?" Elias asked mildly. "Sheriff, what exactly does the law say about a man who drugs his own daughter and ships her off in a coffin?" Sheriff Hayes shifted uncomfortably. The truth was, territorial law was often more flexible than Eastern statutes, especially when public opinion got involved, and word of Helena's rescue had already spread through the small community like wildfire. Dr. Brenner seemed to sense the shifting tide. "Very well," he said coldly. "If my daughter wishes to play at independence, let her, but she will receive no support from me. No inheritance, no family connections, no protection when this frontier fantasy crumbles around her." "I ask for nothing from you," Helena replied. "I never have." "We shall see how long your pride sustains you in this wilderness," Dr. Brenner sneered. He turned to Sheriff Hayes. "I assume you have no objection to my leaving with my property?" "What property?" Hayes asked, genuinely confused. "The coffin, of course. It was quite expensive. Solid mahogany, brass fittings. Surely even frontier justice doesn't extend to theft of valuable property. Elias almost smiled. Help yourself, Doctor. It's down by the creek where you left it. As Dr. Brenner and his men prepared to leave, Helena called out one final time. Father, he turned, and for a moment, his expression held something that might have been hope. When you die, Helena said quietly, and they put you in a coffin just like the one you put me in. Remember this moment. Remember the daughter you chose to bury alive, rather than let her live free. Dr. Brenner's face went hard as stone. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away, his companions trailing behind like shadows. Sheriff Hayes lingered a moment longer, his expression troubled. Miss Brenner, he said finally, if you ever need help, real help, you know where to find me. After they left, Elias and Helena stood in the sudden quiet of the desert morning. The sun was climbing higher now, burning away the last of the dawn mist from Silver Creek. What happens now? Helena asked. Elias considered the question carefully. The truth was, he didn't know. But for the first time since Martha's death, he felt something stirring in his chest that might have been hope. 3 hours after Dr. Brenner's departure, Elias discovered that freedom came with a price he hadn't expected to pay. Helena sat at his kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, staring out the window at the empty desert, with the expression of someone watching her entire world disappear. You're having second thoughts, Elias observed, settling into the chair across from her. Wouldn't you? Helena's laugh held no humor. Yesterday, I was the daughter of one of Chicago's wealthiest men. Today, I'm a penniless woman in the middle of nowhere, dependent on the charity of a stranger. Not charity, Elias said firmly, and not a stranger. Not anymore. Helena looked at him then, really looked, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. He was older than Klaus, probably by 15 years. His face was weathered by desert sun and desert wind, marked by loss and hardship. His clothes were clean but patched, his hands scarred by honest work. Nothing like the soft, educated men she had known in Chicago. What are you thinking? She asked. Elias leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. I'm thinking about what your father said, about the law being on his side. It is, Helena admitted reluctantly. Until I turn 25 or marry, I am legally his property. He could have Sheriff Hayes drag me back to Chicago tomorrow, and there's nothing anyone could do to stop him, unless you weren't his property anymore. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Helena's eyes widened as she understood his meaning. You're suggesting marriage, she said quietly. I'm suggesting a solution to a problem, Elias replied. Nothing more, nothing less. A partnership between two people who find themselves in difficult circumstances. Helena stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, a hawk circled high above the creek, riding the thermals with effortless grace. You don't know anything about me, she said. I could be everything my father claims. Hysterical, unstable, impossible to live with. Could be, Elias agreed, but I don't think you are. Why? He joined her at the window, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that still clung to her hair. Because crazy people don't usually have such clear eyes, and unstable people don't usually speak truth when it costs them everything. And what would it cost you? Helena asked, turning to face him. Taking on a wife you don't know, don't love? What could you possibly gain from such an arrangement? The question hit deeper than she probably intended. Elias thought of Martha, of the empty house that echoed with loneliness, of conversations held with a photograph that never answered back. Company, he said simply. Someone to talk to, who might actually talk back. Is that enough for both of us? Before Elias could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them again. This time, it wasn't Sheriff Hayes. It was Ben Morrison, accompanied by Doc Harrison and 2 other men from town. They dismounted quickly, their faces grim with purpose. Elias, Doc Harrison called out, we need to talk. They gathered in the cabin's small front room, the air thick with tension and unspoken concerns. Doc Harrison, a thin man with kind eyes and steady hands, served as the group's spokesman. "Word's gotten around town about what happened here this morning," he began. "About Dr. Brenner and his unusual methods of transporting his daughter." "And?" Elias prompted. "And folks are talking," Ben Morrison added. "Some are saying you did right, standing up to those city men. But others," he glanced uncomfortably at Helena, "others are wondering if maybe the doctor had a point about Miss Brenner being, well, disturbed." Helena's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "I see." "It ain't personal, miss," one of the other men, Joe Parker, who ran the general store, said quickly. "It's just that decent women don't usually end up floating down creeks in coffins. Makes folks wonder what the real story is." "The real story," Helena said with forced calm, "is that my father tried to murder me for refusing an unwanted marriage. That's a mighty serious charge," Doc Harrison observed. "Hard to prove, even if it's true." Elias felt anger building in his chest. "So what are you suggesting, Doc?" "I'm suggesting that Miss Brenner might be safer and more accepted in the community if her situation was regularized." "You mean if she were married?" Helena said bluntly. "I mean, if she were under the protection of a respected member of the community," Doc Harrison corrected gently. "Someone folks know and trust." The room fell quiet, except for the ticking of Elias's old clock on the mantel. Finally, Ben Morrison cleared his throat. "Elias, you're a good man. Lost your Martha, God rest her soul, but you've kept your land, paid your debts, helped your neighbors when they needed it. Folks respect that." "And Miss Brenner," Joe Parker added, "well, she's clearly educated, well-spoken, could be a real asset to the community, given the right circumstances." Helena laughed bitterly. "How generous of the community to consider accepting me, provided I submit to their conditions." "It ain't like that," Ben protested. "It's just, well, this is a small town, miss. People talk. And unmarried women living alone with men they ain't related to. It causes problems. Even when that woman was nearly murdered by her own father?" "Especially then," Doc Harrison said sadly. "Fair or not, that's the way of things." After the men left, Helena and Elias found themselves alone again, with a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Elias painfully of Martha's hair. "We could leave," Helena suggested suddenly. "Both of us. Go to California or Oregon. Start over somewhere. No one knows our story." "I can't," Elias said simply. "This land, it's all I have left of Martha. Her dreams are buried here as deep as her body. Then I'll go alone." "With what money? What protection?" "Your father was right about one thing. This is hard country for a woman alone." Helena sank back into her chair, the weight of her limited options pressing down on her shoulders. "So marriage it is. A business arrangement between strangers." "It doesn't have to stay that way," Elias said quietly. "What do you mean?" He turned to face her, his gray eyes serious and kind. "I mean that respect can grow into affection. Affection into friendship. And friendship." He paused, remembering Martha's laugh, the way she used to hum while she worked. "Well, friendship is a pretty good foundation for most anything. And if it doesn't, if we remain strangers sharing a house, then at least we'll be free strangers. You from your father, me from this loneliness that's been eating at me since Martha died." Helena studied his face in the dying light, searching for signs of deception or hidden motives. Instead, she found only honest weariness and a kind of quiet courage that reminded her of Klaus in Abus. Not in appearance, but in spirit. "All right," she said finally. "Let's try your solution, Elias Fletcher. But I have conditions." "Name them." "I keep my own name, Helena Brenner Fletcher, if you must. But Helena Brenner remains. I won't be erased completely." "Fair enough." "And I work. I don't sit in this house like a decoration. I earn my keep. This is a working ranch, Miss Brenner. I could use the help. And if I decide to leave, if this arrangement becomes unbearable for either of us, I leave freely. No arguments, no recriminations. Elias extended his hand. Partners? Helena looked at his outstretched hand, scarred by work, honest in its simplicity, and made her choice. Partners, she agreed, and shook it firmly. Outside, the desert night was falling, with the sudden completeness that marked all endings in this harsh, beautiful country. But inside the cabin, two people who had been alone were alone no longer, bound together by necessity and hope in equal measure. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain as the desert wind, but no longer empty. 3 riders appeared on the horizon at sunrise, their dust cloud telling Elias everything he needed to know before they reached his cabin door. Helena stood frozen at the window, her breakfast plate clattering to the floor as she watched her father's men approach with deadly purpose. "They found us," she whispered. But Elias was already reaching for his rifle. The lead rider wore a silver star that caught the morning light, a federal marshal from Phoenix, flanked by 2 of Dr. Brenner's hired guns. Helena's father had played his final card, bringing the full weight of territorial law down on their small sanctuary beside Silver Creek. "Elias Fletcher," the marshal called out, his voice carrying across the dusty yard. "Come out, peaceful-like. We got papers here saying you kidnapped a woman against her will." Helena's hand found Elias's arm, her fingers trembling despite her brave words. "I won't go back. I'd rather die than marry Otto Weiss." But Elias surprised her by setting down his weapon. "Then we won't let them take you," he said simply, as if solving the world's problems was as easy as mending fence. The cabin door swung open, and instead of the desperate fugitives the marshal expected, out walked a man and woman dressed in their Sunday finest. Helena wore Martha's wedding dress altered to fit her smaller frame, while Elias had somehow found a clean shirt and his father's old suit coat. "Marshal?" Elias called out, his voice steady and strong. "I reckon there's been some mistake." "No mistake, Fletcher. That woman belongs to her father until she's legally wed or turns 25. That's the law." Helena stepped forward, her chin raised high despite the guns pointed their way. "Then it's a good thing I got married yesterday evening." She held up her left hand, where Martha's thin gold band caught the desert sun. The marshal's confident expression wavered as Elias produced a folded document from his coat pocket. "Marriage certificate," Elias announced, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "Signed by Judge Morrison in Tucson, witnessed by half the town. Mrs. Helena Fletcher is nobody's property but her own now." The hired guns shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly unprepared for legal complications. They'd come expecting violence, ready to drag a screaming woman back to her father's control. Instead, they faced the solid wall of territorial law properly followed. Dr. Brenner's lead man, a scarred fellow named Curtis, spat in the dust. "Papers can be forged. That woman was declared mentally incompetent by her own father. Not in Arizona territory, she wasn't," came a new voice from behind the cabin. Judge Morrison himself rode into view, accompanied by Sheriff Hayes and 3 other witnesses from the previous evening's ceremony. "I signed those papers myself, and I'll swear to their truth in any court you care to name." The marshal examined the documents with growing unease. Everything appeared legal and proper: signatures, seals, witness statements. His authority to act was melting away like snow in the desert sun. "There's also the matter of attempted murder," Judge Morrison continued calmly. "Drugging a woman and sealing her in a coffin tends to be frowned upon by territorial courts." Curtis reached for his gun, but found himself staring down the barrels of 6 rifles held by men who'd fought Apaches and lived to tell about it. The Arizona Territory had a way of teaching quick justice to those who threatened its citizens. "I suggest you gentlemen ride back to Phoenix," Sheriff Hayes said with deceptive mildness. "Tell Dr. Brenner his daughter is legally wed and under the protection of territorial law. Any further attempts at kidnapping will be met with appropriate force." The standoff stretched like a wire, ready to snap. Helena felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched armed men calculate odds and outcomes. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the peaceful morning would explode into gunfire. But Curtis was a practical man who recognized defeat when it stared him in the face. He jerked his horse's head around and spurred toward the horizon, his companions following without a backward glance. The marshal lingered longer, studying the papers one final time before reluctantly handing them back. "This isn't finished," he warned. "Dr. Brenner has connections in Washington, federal judges who might see things differently." "Then they can send proper warrants through proper channels," Judge Morrison replied firmly. "Until then, Mrs. Fletcher is under the protection of Arizona territorial law." As the dust settled behind the departing riders, Helena felt her knees go weak with relief. Elias caught her before she could fall, his strong arms steadying her as the magnitude of their victory sank in. "Is it really over?" she asked, hardly daring to believe. "The legal part is," Judge Morrison assured her. "Your father may try again, but he'll have to work within the law now, and that gives you time to build a life here, to put down roots too deep for anyone to pull up." The celebration that followed was nothing like the grand affairs Dr. Brenner had planned for his daughter's marriage to Otto Weiss. There was no orchestra or champagne, no silk gowns or imported flowers. Instead, they had fiddle music and corn whiskey, dancing on the cabin's rough wooden floor, and laughter that echoed across the desert morning. Helena danced first with her new husband, then with Judge Morrison, then with Sheriff Hayes himself. Each partner whispered the same message: welcome home, welcome to the family, welcome to Arizona territory, where a person's past mattered less than their character. Mrs. Morrison produced a wedding cake from her wagon, somehow transported intact across miles of rough terrain. Doc Harrison brought medical supplies and a promise to check on Helena whenever she needed. Even Ben Morrison shyly offered a hand-carved wooden box as a wedding gift. "For keeping important papers," he explained, blushing to the roots of his sandy hair. As the impromptu celebration wound down and the neighbors began preparing for their journey back to town, Helena found herself alone with Elias on their porch. The morning had transformed from terror to triumph, but the cost of constant vigilance was beginning to show on both their faces. "Do you think they'll really leave us alone?" Helena asked. Elias considered the question with the careful thought he gave to all serious matters. "Your father's a proud man who's used to getting his way. He won't give up easy, but pride cuts both ways. He won't want to risk another public failure." The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning mist and revealing the harsh beauty of their desert home. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried as it rode the thermal currents, free and wild and answerable to no master. "What happens now?" Helena asked. "Now we build something together," Elias said, and in his voice she heard the promise of mornings yet to come, of seasons they would weather side by side, of a love grown not from desperation, but from choice. The Silver Creek gurgled in the distance, carrying away the last traces of fear and bringing the first whispers of hope. They had won more than a legal victory. They had claimed the right to write their own story in the endless expanse of Arizona sky. 6 months later, as autumn painted the Nebraska plains in shades of gold and crimson, Elias knelt again by Silver Creek. But this time he wasn't alone. Helena worked beside him, her hands dirty with honest soil, her laughter bright as creek water over stones. They were building a new fence line, expanding the property to accommodate the cattle they'd bought with Helena's unexpected inheritance. Her father had died of apoplexy 2 weeks after their wedding, leaving her everything, perhaps his final attempt to control her fate, or perhaps, as Helena preferred to believe, his last act of paternal love. "Do you ever regret it?" Elias asked, pausing in his work to watch her struggle with a particularly stubborn fence post. "Marrying a strange man to escape your father?" Helena looked up, her face streaked with mud and bright with exertion. "Do you regret pulling a coffin from the water?" "Never," he said, and knew it was true. That evening, they sat again on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope. Inside, Martha's photograph still held its place of honor, but beside it, now stood a new picture. Their wedding portrait, formal and stiff, but Helena's eyes bright with mischief, and Elias's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Sometimes the creek still brought them gifts, a broken wagon wheel, a child's lost toy, messages in bottles from unknown senders upstream. But never another coffin, never another soul in need of saving. Perhaps because they'd already found what they were looking for in each other. Not the desperate salvation of drowning people, but the quiet, steady love of two souls, who'd learned that the deepest currents aren't always the most dangerous ones. In Silver Creek, they said, love could find you when you least expected it, even floating downstream in a coffin, waterlogged but breathing, ready for resurrection.